And if you will turn to Ephesians chapter 6, we're going to be continuing our study in the book of Ephesians. Ephesians chapter 6. If you remember, we're kind of going through these different relationships of authority that we encounter as Christians quite often. And Paul is showing how important it is that each of these relationships incorporate who we are as Christians within the very heart of these relationships. And so today we're going to be picking up with the slaves and master relationship. And it's not the slaves and masters that you typically think of, and we'll explain that as we go through here. But for now, let's just read the verses, and then we'll make comment. We're going to be starting in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5, and going through verse 9. It says, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in the sincerity of your heart as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With goodwill render service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. And masters, do the same things to them, and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him." Okay, so as we read this, I don't know if we're reading it from a 21st century Western culture mindset or from a first century Roman context. But when he's talking about slaves and masters, we're not talking about what we typically think about, going back, say, 150 years and further, where we had slaves in this nation. This word for slaves in the Greek is doulos, and the word doulos is a very general term for anyone who is subservient to another person in the labor field. So it literally means to bind your will to another person. So the idea is that in any situation where you have submitted yourself to the authority of another person, it applies. So that could indicate maybe a slave and master as we think about it, maybe from the first century. If you're in that situation, these things could apply. But it's more general than that. It can also apply to us even as we go to the workplace day to day. Because what we do when we apply for a job and we get hired on is we are basically agreeing to the fact that we're going to be under the authority of our supervisors on up to what we call on the base chain of command, all the way up, and we're going to basically work for those people and receive, of course, paid for it. But it covers all different facets of that type of thing. Now, as we read through here, you might have noticed some things that might have caught your attention. As we're going through here and talking about slaves and masters, notice how many times Christ is mentioned in here. As he says, as to Christ, verse 5. Verse 6, but as slaves of Christ, the will of God from the heart, also verse 6. Render service as to the Lord, verse 7. Verse 8, they receive back from the Lord. Look how many times God and Jesus is mentioned in that. And that's interesting because I think in our minds, that's why I brought the board up, in our minds we have this compartmentalizing that goes on in our lives. And it's interesting that the way that we typically compartmentalize our lives are actually the very things that Paul talks about in the book of Ephesians. If you were to kind of break up your life into the different sections, the different aspects of your life, I imagine probably the way you would break it up is similar to this. First you'd have, of course, God. Okay, so I have my life in connection to God, what some might call the religious life, the spiritual life, whatever you want to call it, but it's everything that's connected to God. And then I have my family. Pretty obvious what that would be referring to. Of course, our family life, whether we have small children in the home, or if it's with our husband, or, cousins, uncles, aunts, whatever. We have our family life. This is what we do after we get home from work. These are activities we get involved in. But it's all in connection to the family. And then lastly, we would think about our career or our job. Say, okay, this is where I go, 9 to 5. during the day, Monday through Friday, typically, and that's my career. That's a facet of my life that I'm pursuing, trying to maybe go up the corporate ladder, trying to, further my career. But that's another aspect of my life. And so all these things are kind of separated. What we find in the book of Ephesians is that Paul takes the truth about who we are in Christ and what God has done for us to make us who we are, and he takes that truth and he basically integrates that, mixes it in with every aspect of these different things. In chapter 4, we saw how it affects us in the church. Chapters 1 through 3, let me just make this statement. Chapters 1 through 3 was about that. Y'all might remember we talked about how chapters 1 through 3 is all about what God has done for us and who we are as a result of what he's done for us. And then he gets into chapter 4 and he says, therefore, you need to walk in a manner that is worthy of the calling. So he's saying that, so this ought to work out into your life. And then he goes into the church life in chapter 4, which is one of the facets of our lives that we think about God. We think about church. We think about, on Sunday morning we get up, we come to church. That's a part of my life. But he goes on to explain how rich that aspect of your life should be as you exercise your gift to build up the body, as you're being equipped in the church service by those who are teachers and pastors and all those different types of roles, that we can take those and build up the body of Christ. And so who you are in Christ based upon what he's done goes into your church life. But then he goes into husbands and wives, parents and children, the latter part of chapter 5 leading into chapter 6. And he talks about the family life, but he doesn't just talk about it like, okay, well, wives, be in subjection to your husbands. Husbands, be nice to your wives. Okay, let's move on. What he does is he incorporates everything that we know about Christ and just inundates the husband-wife relationship with that truth. He says, wives, be subject to your husband, even as the church is subject to Christ. And so he takes what you know about the church and its relationship to Christ and he integrates that into the wife to husband relationship. But then he goes further and he takes, as Christ loved the church, so husbands ought to love their wives. And he talks about how Christ gave himself up for the church and all the things that Christ did for the church. And he says, okay, husbands, because you know that about Christ and that love that you saw demonstrated in Christ towards the church, take that, integrate it into your relationship with your wife and demonstrate it. And then we looked also at the parent-child relationship, how many times in scriptures God is kind of a father figure to us in that we are his children. And the whole spiritual, the things that we know about Christ is integrated into that. Well, we see the same theme being followed even with our job, our workplace. To where we no longer see our lives in these categories, God, family, job, career. But we have more of something like this, and maybe you've seen diagrams like this before, but you have your job, you have your family, maybe different relationships. You could categorize things in different ways, but where they're separate, then you have God, and you have this circle, and then like God kind of covers it all. And that's an okay diagram, just to show that God and a relationship with God kind of covers all that. But I think a better one, and I was thinking about this before, I think maybe a better one to illustrate it is to think about vessels or cups. Think about each one of these aspects of your life. Say your family. I already have a lot of room to write it, but family, church, job. So look at each of these more as like a glass, a cup. And then you have God up here coming in and just pouring himself into each of these things to where God, your spiritual life, your connection, your relationship to God, your communion with God, your love for God, your commitment to God, everything about your life and connection to God bleeds into and overflows all these other aspects of your life. So where they're not just touching God in a sense where this is my career and then I have God kind of around it, but I have God actually coming in and filling it and flooding it to where my going to work from 9 to 5 is actually a spiritual experience, not just a physical need some money so that I can pay the bills experience. It's saying I can glorify Christ In my job, I can glorify Christ. In my family, I can glorify Christ in my church. And so God becomes the focus of everything. It's no longer about me and these outward things. It's all about Him and bringing Him into everything about my life. And so this is exactly what we find here with the job site, with the slave to master relationship, or what we would call the employee-employer relationship. So looking at it from that aspect, now let's go back and look at these things in more detail. Going back to Ephesians 6 and verse 5, he says, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters." And maybe as you read that, some of us are saying, yes, I know this is true. I need to be obedient to my boss. You know why I think I should be obedient to my boss? Because I've got a good boss. My boss, he takes care of his employees. He always makes sure that we have what we need to take care of the job. He's fair. He doesn't show partiality. He always makes sure that we get bonuses when we're supposed to get them. He doesn't overlook us. He communicates well with us. I have a good boss, so yeah, I really like this verse. Some people read this section and say, wait a minute, Joey. Whoa. You don't know my boss. This verse is telling me to be obedient to my boss, but I look at my boss and he shows favoritism, or she shows favoritism. I've been up for a promotion for 2 years now and haven't got the promotion yet. They always say, yeah, we're going to get a bonus, and it never comes. He's not forthright with us. He works behind the scenes against us. All these other things. And you might have this long list of things that your boss does, and you say, this verse doesn't apply to me because of my boss. Well, let's just turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. And Peter's going to give us some very straightforward instructions on this. What do you do in a case like that? What do you do in the case when your boss doesn't live up to the standard that you think he or she should live up to? Well, this is what Peter says. This is 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 18. "Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable." Have you ever had an unreasonable employer? Maybe all of us have had some experience with that. Why? In verse 19 it says, "For this finds favor, if for the sake of conscience towards God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly." So there's two things about this employer or master that's being described here. He's unreasonable, and maybe he even deals with you unjustly. But what does Peter say? He says, still be submissive to them. Why? Because of the position that they hold over you, the authority that they have. And it's not really them that you're serving, it's Christ that you're serving. And it's God that you're serving. This is something that's so difficult and so hard to get into the heads of 21st century Americans. Because we're all about our rights. We're all about, I get what I have coming to me. This is my list of rights, and you better fulfill my rights, or else you're going to hear about it. And I'm going to go and just wreak havoc until I get my rights. Peter's not teaching that. Peter is saying, no matter how they treat you, even if they do violate some of what you think are your rights, still submit to them. Why? Because your ultimate service is not to them. Your ultimate service is to God. And so see how the spiritual life incorporates itself even in these type of scenarios. And so he says to do this. And then there's another reason for this as well as we continue in verse 20, still in 1 Peter chapter 2. It says, "For what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God." So you could rebel against your boss. You could talk behind the back of your boss. You could slander your boss. You can do a lot of things. And then if you suffer because of that, he says there's no joy in that. But if you continue to do what you know is right, you continue to show up every day, give your 110%, you're doing what's good for the company, you're doing good for your boss, even though you don't agree with his techniques and his tactics, you still are a dedicated employee, that finds favor with the Lord. And so you're suffering, but at least you're suffering for something that is good, and you know in that suffering, hey, at least I'm pleasing the Lord. and my relationship with God is shown priority, and it shows itself through this. So I just want to put that in the very beginning of this so that you don't check out as we go through the rest of this, because what we're going to find is that Paul is not just giving us obey your boss. We're going to see that it's a whole attitude thing as well as we move forward. But anyways, so going back to Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 5, he says, slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh. Okay, so we all know that according to the Spirit, according to everything else, God is our master, but we also have masters according to the flesh. In other words, on this earth. I think that's pretty clear. But he says, now he gets into the attitude. So he spends basically half a sentence talking about obedience, but he's going to spend pretty much the rest of the time talking about attitude. And that's very important, because religious people are sometimes the best actors. And we find this throughout the Gospels, and Jesus encountered this quite a bit with the religious leaders. We are really good at acting sometimes, because we know what we're supposed to do, and as long as we think, as long as I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, it's okay. As long as I'm coming to church, it's okay. As long as I'm praying, it's okay. As long as I'm doing the rules that my boss tells me to do, I'm okay. But in the Scriptures, what we find, it's not just enough to do what you're supposed to do. It's all about the heart behind doing what you're supposed to do. That's what God is really looking for, is your heart. So when you go, yeah, you might check off the list that you came to church, but when you went to church, did you give it your 110%? Did you worship God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength? Did you exalt Christ in your heart when you came to worship? Did you give Him your whole self when you came? That's what really matters. Yeah, it's important to come, because you can't do that if you don't do the other, but it's not just about doing the outward things. And so even in the workplace, the religious person might think, well, okay, I've read Ephesians chapter 6, I'm supposed to be obedient to my boss. So my boss tells me something to do, and I roll my eyes and I say, okay, I'll do it. And I'm obedient, I follow the rules just like I'm supposed to, but it's always begrudgingly, it's always, the boss almost has to twist my arm to do it, but yet I'm following the rules, so I must be okay. Paul's going to eliminate that possibility as we move forward. Because he says, be obedient, but, look, with fear and trembling. As you're reading through the book of Ephesians, that's a statement that you probably would just skip over. I'm reading about husbands and wives. I'm reading through here. I read about children, obedient to parents. Fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath. Move on through the work relationship. And, okay, I'm supposed to be obedient to my boss. Keep on going. And this might be overlooked, this idea of fear and trembling before your boss. What this means is that you're not just to obey the rules, but you are to give your boss the utmost respect. Even to the unruly, to the unreasonable, to the unjust bosses, you give them your respect. You say, I respect you. I may not respect your morals, I may not respect your tactics, your leadership tactics, but I respect your position above me. Because remember, we're looking beyond the person, we're looking to Christ as our ultimate master. But he says to do it with fear and trembling, to give them the respect that is due to their position. And then he says, in the sincerity of your heart. And so, once again, we might pretend to be respecting our boss and pretending to follow, or we might be following the rules, but it's just an outward thing. But it's also got to be with sincerity. I'm doing it from my heart. I'm doing it because I know this is the right thing to do. And he'll explain more what that means, what sincerity of heart means as we move forward. He says, as to Christ. And then this is the description of what sincerity of heart is. Not by way of eye service as men pleasers. Eye service. So this is this is a term that Paul kind of is really the only person that uses that phrase, eye service. He uses it here, and then he also uses it in the book of Colossians as well. But the concept is that you're not serving your boss, you're not serving your company, you're serving your boss's eyes. All right, so I've seen this at the job place, and I'm sure you've seen it too. You come to work, and you get news that the boss is called in sick. And everybody looks around and says, all right, free day. The boss isn't here. We're going to kind of piddle. We're going to get enough done to where when he comes back, or she comes back, they'll see that something got done. But we don't really have to work quite as hard. It's the whole atmosphere of the job site kind of relaxes a little bit because the boss isn't there. And we see that probably in our coworkers and things, and even in our hearts. And this is a very easy trap to get into, to think about the fact that the boss, I only serve the boss when he's there. So I might be doing something totally un-job related, but the boss comes by and all of a sudden I want to look busy. All of a sudden I want to look like I'm doing something. You see how you're just serving his or her eyes. You're not serving them as a position. You're not doing what is best for the company. You're just doing what's best for yourself. It's a very selfish way of working for your boss. It really is. And so I'm just trying to serve their eyes. And then it says, as men pleasers. One source that I read said that this might mean men pleasers as far as your fellow coworkers. You want to go along with what your coworkers are doing. You don't want to be like a goody two shoes. So you kind of follow along. And I almost bought into that until I cross-referenced Colossians chapter 2. And I think it really is talking about as far as trying to please the boss as a man pleaser. In Colossians chapter 3, in verse 20, let's say 22, we'll start in 22. It says, slaves in all things obey those who are your masters on earth, not with external service as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. So whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men. And so that one really kind of brought it home for me, that what he's talking about is that if you're just serving the eye of your boss, when they come around, then your whole position, your whole dedication to the company, your whole dedication to your job is really just to make your boss happy, and it's not ultimately looking beyond your boss to Christ. Because if you think about your boss as looking past your boss to Christ, then you know that Christ is with you wherever you go. You know his eyes see everything that you do. And so there is no waiting for the boss to leave, because the boss is always present. Christ is always present. He's living in you. He's in your midst. He's with you at the workplace, and he sees what you're doing. And so as you're working, the boss may be in Timbuktu, and you're over here working. My true boss is here with me right now, present with me. And so I'm going to still be diligent. I'm still going to do my best job, do the best job possible, and do what is best for the company. And so that's what he's talking about here. Not just working so that you can please your boss or get on his good side, but you're serving the true master, Christ himself. Matter of fact, he'll go on to say that in Ephesians 6, verse 6. After he says, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Remember, it all goes back to the heart. Outwardly, you can look like the best employee, but if you're not engaged in your heart, then you're not really fulfilling what God truly wants for you in the workplace. In verse 7, with good will render service as to the Lord and not to men. Okay, so with good will render service as to the Lord. Do what is good to the Lord. Why? In verse 8, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free. So this should be an encouragement to you as you're in the workplace, and you have an option. You have an option to do some good, because we might think, well, if I do good things for the company, that's just good for the company. Well, what this shows us is that when we do things that are good for our employer, when we do things that are good for the company, God actually recognizes that. It means that I go to the workplace with integrity in my heart. I'm always looking at what's best for the company, what's best for the boss, because I know that filters out into my fellow employees. If the company does well, my fellow employees will do well as well. We'll all prosper together. And so you're doing good service while at the job site, recognizing the fact that God sees the good that you do, even if nobody else does, and you know that good will be rendered back to you. This should shatter our whole perception of life and this whole idea of these different sections. Because a lot of times we might think that, well, what I do for my boss is for my boss, and what I do for my wife is for my wife, and what I do for... No, it's all for God. Any good that you do you render good to anybody at any time in any place, it's as though you're doing it to the Lord. Remember what Christ said in Matthew chapter 25 when you have the judgment scene? And he says, when you came to me when I was sick. You came to me when I was thirsty. You came to me when I was hungry. And the righteous are saying, Lord, when did we come to you when you were thirsty, when you're hungry, when you're in prison, and all these other things? He said, inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, you did it unto me. And so God takes very personal when we go out and do good works, no matter in what facet of our lives we do it in. So we can take some pride, not pride in that we get prideful, but just in the fact that we know that we're doing the right thing when we do what is good for the company, even if nobody else notices. Then he moves on to the masters. As we've seen, with all these relationships, he starts with those in the submissive role, and then he gets into the leadership. Leadership is very, very key, but it takes those in the submission roles doing the right thing so that the leaders can do what they need to do and treat them in the right way. It says, and masters, do the same things to them. Okay, do what things to them? Well, he just got through talking about doing good. So imagine this workplace where the employees are always doing what's right for the company, even when nobody knows about it, even when no one even cares, maybe even sometimes when other employees are calling them a goody two-shoes and making fun of them in that way, but you still do what is right. And then you have the boss who's always seeking the good of his employees, always seeing what is good for them, what will help them, what will encourage them, build them up. And both are interested in doing the good for the other. What a wonderful workplace that would be, right? We would all love to work in a workplace like that. But it all starts with us. It starts with us as Christians. It says, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. So you have the same master. You might be all the way up the chain of command, even up to the President of the United States, and you still have a master that you're serving. So the employee has to remember he has a master he's serving. The employer, the boss, has to remember that he has a master that he's serving. And both, because they recognize that relationship with their master, does good to one another in the process. Wonderful, beautiful picture of what it could be like. And so what I was thinking about this morning is what a change we can make as Christians if we started looking at things in this particular way as Christians. If we started looking at it in this way, it ought to be that a person who's applying for a job, if he put that he's a Christian on the resume, it ought to say, hey, this is a guy that we want. Because what does most employers want? They want someone who's honest. They want someone who has integrity. They want someone who works hard. They want someone who's dedicated, someone they can count on. They're looking for these type of things. And guess what? Those are the exact things that the Bible teaches us to be. And so if we're really applying the Christian life and we're letting God infiltrate even our job and our career, we'll be the model employees. And people will begin to maybe connect two and two and say, you know what, this Christian people that we hear about, they're the best working people, best working class in America. And we can make a change through that to where we can make a difference, even in things that we think are disconnected and doesn't even make that aren't that big of a deal. So this is our lesson this morning. I thank you guys for listening. But one thing that, as we close, one thing we want to think about is this idea that we do have a master in heaven. We do have a God in heaven who is watching our lives. And maybe you're here this morning and you haven't submitted to the master. The master is God. He's the one that created us, gave us life, gave us breath. But he's also the one who has given us a standard to live by. And as we look on our lives, we all know that we've fallen short of that standard in one way or the other. Just looking at the Ten Commandments, we can find several things that we've done where we've fallen short. But we shouldn't be in despair. We should look to Christ, who became for us our sacrifice, so that we can now have a relationship with God. If you would like to have a relationship restored back to God, for him to become your master and Lord in your life, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that David has prepared. 344.